Good evening, everyone. My name is Katharine Viner. I'm Editor-in-Chief of The Guardian. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very exciting Guardian Live event with Naomi Klein. A few words about how this evening will work. We'll be live online for an hour. For the first half an hour, I'll be talking to Naomi, and after that, we'll take some questions from you. And a couple of the ways that you can do this. Some of you have sent your questions in advance. Thanks very much for that, and I'll try and fit in as many as we can. And you can also send us written questions via the Q&A function on your screen, which is to the right of the window. You can choose to be anonymous or use your name. You can send your questions throughout the evening, and we'll spend the second half of the event answering them. Please keep your questions as short and concise as possible. And while we may not get to you all, we will try to answer as many of them as Naomi Klein, our guest today, is one of the world's great thinkers. Naomi Klein burst onto the scene in 1999 with her stunning work, No Logo. At the time, she was labelled the prophet of the new politics by The Guardian, and we've been dazzled by Naomi's work ever since. Her book, The Shock Doctrine, brilliantly reveals how disaster capitalists swoop in on communities destroyed by natural disasters or war in order to exploit them for their own profits. I hope today we'll be talking about what this means for the COVID crisis as well. This Changes Everything, Naomi's next book, argued that true action on the climate was impossible unless extreme neoliberal economics was rejected. It was truly ahead of its time. The 2017 book, No Is Not Enough, is a tour de force about Donald Trump, which examined the US president through the prisms of branding, shock, climate denialism, and extreme capitalism, bringing together threads from 20 years of work. And Naomi's latest book, On Fire, is a stunning addition to an already great body of work. It will, she hopes, inspire governments around the world to adopt a Green New Deal. As Greta Thunberg says, Naomi Klein's work has always moved and guided me. She is the great chronicler of our age of climate emergency. She is an inspirer of generations. Hello, Naomi. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Kath. I'm so happy to be with you, and thank you for that very, very generous introduction.
So how are you finding lockdown?
How am I finding lockdown? Well, it's been a while now, and I'm definitely aware of what a privilege it is to be able to lock down. I spent, I guess, 4 months in New Jersey, which is very much a COVID hotspot. But in the part of New Jersey where I live, we're ringed by Amazon warehouses and hospitals. So many of my neighbors and so many members of my community were deemed essential workers and really just in the teeth of this crisis. So those of us who were teaching our students by Zoom, as I was and homeschooling, and doing that juggle and figuring out how to bake. I mean, we had it really cushy. And now I'm back in Canada for the summer with my family and in quarantine, because in Canada, if you come from the U.S., you have to be in very strict quarantine. So haven't left the house in almost 2 weeks, and I'm used to it is the answer, Kath. I mean, I'm actually sort of developing some phobias about leaving lockdown.
I bet you're not starting to enjoy video calls, though, are we? We spoke earlier in lockdown about how we both find this a really unpleasant way to interact.
Yeah, and I don't feel that way right now because, I'm talking, this is more of a conversation, but doing speeches sort of into the abyss it's unique. It's uniquely draining because it reminds you that that when we gather, we share energy with each other, right? It is an interplay. Even if you're up there giving a lecture for 45 minutes, you are in dialogue with the people in the room, and you're hearing the sharp intakes of breath and the cathartic laughs, and there is an exchange of energy that we just don't get when we're just outputting into the camera and into the microphone. It's not a healthy way to live. It's not how I want to live. But I mean, I think there are advantages. Like On Fire came out in Greece a few weeks ago, and we had a proper virtual book launch with a press conference and everything. And this, it's interesting because this is something I've pushed my publishers to try to do more of over the years. Like, let's use this technology and save travel for what is truly essential. and maybe we share our in-person spaces and gatherings for more regional and local gatherings where we have that exchange of energy, and we don't fly for things we don't have to fly for.
But we are, I mean, we're missing each other, aren't we? We're missing people. I mean, there's a great quote in one of your recent essays, I think it's from a tech CEO, where she says, humans are biohazards, machines are not. that chilled me to the bone. That made me fearful for the future. And you've written quite interestingly about the Screen New Deal, about how the crisis has been really good for the kind of, well, lots of bad things in society.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do miss each other. And I think, this is one of the things that we need to learn the lessons of this really extraordinary period that we're living through. This is not anything I've experienced. This is not anything my parents have experienced. This isn't even anything my grandparents would have experienced in this kind of global, it's not a lockdown for everyone. It isn't a pause for everybody. But this deliberate decision to close down huge sectors of the economy, this hasn't happened before. And it's certainly not on this scale. And so what have we learned from it? And I think one of the things we've learned is how much we miss each other. A lot of us, and I think this crosses class boundaries, have developed different relationships with the natural world. I mentioned healthcare workers. So many healthcare workers talk about coming off these long shifts and just being dazzled by the flowers. There is such a dissonance in the Northern Hemisphere, I think, about the fact that this pandemic hits in spring, right? And we're living with this contradiction of just wrapping our minds around this pain and mass death. And I know we'll talk about how unequal the death toll has been in terms of the communities of color, particularly Black communities who have borne such an outsized burden, both in terms of having to work in the crisis and also in bodily vulnerabilities to it for so many different reasons. But I think in the Northern Hemisphere, it hits in springtime, and so we're wrapping our minds around this period of death and this period of life, of bloom all around us. And so, that's another really important lesson that we need to take about the importance of the natural world, because so many of us have taken solace from the return of birdsong, from the fact that, walking home after these long shifts, you are surrounded by birdsong and flowers blooming. And that's important. And so, you mentioned that quote from a tech executive talking about humans as biohazards, right? And I think, and this is the piece that you ran in The Guardian about what I'm calling a Screen New Deal, tongue in cheek, right? That Silicon Valley had this pre-existing agenda before COVID that imagined replacing so many of our personal, bodily, embodied experiences by inserting technology in the middle of them. So, the few spaces where tech is not mediating our relationships, there was a plan to replace in-person teaching with virtual learning, for instance, and in-person medicine with telehealth, and in-person delivery with robots, remote controlled. And all of this has been rebranded post-COVID as a touchless technology, as a way of replacing what is being diagnosed as the problem, which is the problem of touch. And yet, on a personal level, what we miss most is touch, as V, formerly Eve Ensler, wrote so beautifully in The Guardian. And so we need to expand, I think, the menu of options about how we live with COVID, right? Because we don't have a vaccine. It isn't about to arrive. Even if there is a breakthrough, it's going to be many, many months, possibly years before it's able to be rolled out at the scale that we would need it. And so how are we going to live with this thing? Are we going to accept pre-COVID, quote unquote, normal, only much diminished, right? Without those relationships that sustain us, Are we going to allow our kids to have all of their learning mediated by technology? Or are we going to invest in people? I mean, this is one of the big lessons of the pandemic is the fact that we are finally appreciating care workers, in particular healthcare workers. But I don't think there are many parents who aren't silently praying to the altar of their teachers who used to teach their kids, or the daycare workers. And so instead of pouring our money into a Green New Deal and trying to solve all of our problems with technology, which actually diminishes quality of life in so many ways, why don't we go on a teacher hiring spree, right? Why don't we have twice as many teachers with half the size classrooms and figure out a way to do outdoor education for all of spring, right? There are so many ways that we can think about responding to this crisis that don't accept this idea that we have to accept a pre-COVID status quo, only worse, only with more surveillance and more screens and less human contact.
Do you see any governments talking like that?
I was heartened to hear Jacinda Ardern talk about a 4-day work week as a solution to the fact that New Zealand is very dependent on tourism dollars. And yet New Zealand is also the country that has probably dealt with the pandemic better than any other in terms of their fatality rates. And so they can't fling their doors open to tourists in the way that they have in the past. So this idea of, maybe New Zealanders should work less and be paid the same and have more leisure time to be able to enjoy their own country safely. And, I think that this, there's always a danger of the ways in which demagogues are using the crisis to further a xenophobic, racist agenda. And that is most certainly happening in many, many parts of the world, including the US. But that's not, I think, the spirit that it's happening in New Zealand. Practically speaking, tourism is a problem, and we have to, and so we do have large parts of our economy that rely on tourism. But if we're all sort of working at the velocity that we were working pre-COVID, then we don't actually have time to enjoy our surroundings, So how do we slow down? I mean, this is what I'm sort of thinking a lot about, Kath. It's like it feels like every time we slam our foot on the accelerator, marked business as usual or back to normal, right? The virus surges back and says, slow down.
But it's so in Britain. I feel the need to slow down, like you describe. We all love those moments of slowing down, although they were tinged with a lot of fear. But the government just is absolutely hell-bent on getting back to normal, come what may. Everything opening, pubs opening. They're really desperate to get us to go on holiday. There's just this sort of urgency. No, nothing's changed. Not to change anything about how we live. Just get back to how it was before. And like you said, the virus maybe has other ideas.
And it's madness. And I think the other thing that's important for us to remember when we're all dealing with the consequences of that is that it is not coming from the bottom up. It's coming from the top down. There isn't a massive movement, even in the United States, clamoring for the reopening. It is very much a grass tops movement. An AstroTurf kind of movement, right? Funded by the same people who funded the Tea Party, and being stoked by Republican leaders, in your case, being stoked by the Tories. It's a very small percentage of the population that wants to just fling the doors open. It is a majority that actually is much more concerned about returning to work before it's safe, sending their kids to school before it's safe. And so I think sometimes this is framed as giving people what they want, but this is not what the polling shows. The polling does not show that people are wanting this. They're being told by reckless leaders that this is a fantasy, that we can live with it, that it's going to be like the flu. And I think we see some similarities between the way Johnson has handled it and the way Bolsonaro has handled it and the way Trump has handled it, where it's sort of like they're turning this into some test of masculinity. And even Johnson, after having the virus, right, is you hear Bolsonaro talking about how he was an athlete, so he knows he'll handle it, or Trump talking about his good genes.
But Naomi, Boris Johnson, with a journalist the other day, did some press ups to show how fit he was.
Oh my God. Sorry. Is he really that fit?
I think it was everyone in the audience to say, God, we wish you had Jacinda Ardern as our Prime Minister.
Oh,
Maybe there's
yeah.
people calling it New Zealand and they can tell us about that, but we're just a bit jealous.
Yeah, and I mean, this virus will not be bullied. It is not interested in camera stunts. And I think that for this sort of class of leader that is so used to and so adept at this sort of politics of performance, right? Johnson, we might not like it. He's good at it. He's good at it. He's good at the politics of the stunt. So is Trump. So is Duterte, right? I mean, they're sort of masters. Even Bolsonaro, in his own way, is a master of the Facebook age, of the WhatsApp age, and they're used to just being able to edit and distort reality for their own gains. And whether that means putting out false memes or whether that means treating your presidency like a reality show, this is their skill. And they are now confronting something that will not be shaped or edited. It's resistant to that. To treating reality as an entirely malleable idea, and they're kind of falling apart in the face of this, or at least Trump is. It's an interesting unraveling, and I think it's true for Bolsonaro as well. Johnson, I don't know, is Johnson weathering this?
I wouldn't say so. No, I mean, in terms of the polls, he's now behind, which when you think he won an election just a few months ago, that's pretty extraordinary. So, he won it convincingly. So, just to go into another slightly different direction, I was interested in your views in why you think these civil rights protests, in light of George Floyd's murder on camera, why they've happened now. It seems very intriguing in the midst of one crisis. There's around the world these huge demonstrations against racism.
Well, I think that there are a few, or at least two aspects of it to unpack. One is from the perspective of African Americans in the United States, and the question of the strength of the response, which has happened many times before. But I think that there were certain aspects of it that were unique to the COVID moment, having to do with the outsized impact of the pandemic for African Americans. In cities like Chicago, by some counts, 70% of the fatalities from COVID were African Americans. So many African American workers were being classified as essential in a kind of act of violence, right? As a way of just ordering people into unsafe working conditions. And so you heard this, a lot of essential workers talk about being simultaneously essential and sacrificial. And so I think that there was something in being in a crisis that was taking and is continuing to take such a huge and outsized toll on Black people in America, whether because they are the ones performing those at-risk jobs without protections, or because of the legacies of environmental pollution in their communities, stress, trauma, food deserts, unsafe workplaces. Their bodies are more vulnerable to the virus itself. They're facing discriminatory healthcare. And so in the midst of this moment of profound trauma, those murders of Ahmaud Arbery, of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, slice through that, right? And it is, it's, I think, similar to some of the uprisings in the aftermath of wars, where there have been very outsized sacrifices by African American soldiers, that then when there is lynching and police killings, then that it is. I mean, it's never fair, but the injustice of it is particularly stinging and catalyzing, right? So I think there's that. But then there's the question that a lot of people are asking, which is, okay, in many cases throughout history, Black people have risen up against state violence and vigilante white violence. But what are all these not Black people doing at the protests? And that is what is new. And certainly at the scale, right? That many of these demonstrations are truly multiracial. They are Black-led multiracial demonstrations. And so the question of why non-Black people who have, and I say non-Black because it isn't only white people, it's truly multiracial, who have sort of said, well, this is an issue for Black people to fight on, and did not stand up, in the 2016 BLM uprisings, or didn't sort of say, well, what's happening in Ferguson is my fight too. Why is this different? And that is a question I don't think we have fully answered. And I think but I have a few ideas, and I think one of them has to do with just a kind of a softness that the pandemic has introduced into our culture, both because we have slowed down. Those of us who've had the luxury of slowing down, when you slow down, you can feel things. When you're in that constant sort of rat race, it doesn't leave as much time for empathy. It's sort of like, yeah, I'll think about that later. Right now, I'm, head down, moving ahead in the capitalist, velocity. But another piece of it, I think, has to do with just the virus has forced us to think about interdependencies and relationships from its very beginning, from that the very first day when the pandemic was declared in mid-March. The U.S. was late to admit that this was happening. But as soon as it happens, the first thing you're thinking about is everything I touch, what has somebody else touched, right? The food I'm eating, the package that was just delivered, the food on the shelves. And these are connections that capitalism teaches us not to think about. Things are just magically appear, right? And this in some ways comes back to what I wrote about in No Logo. Like, it's all about not knowing who makes our stuff, how it gets to us, right?
Yeah.
It is a culture of endless amnesia, denial, and disappearing of that which is not right in front of our noses, right? Whether that's atmospheric pollution or whether it's the labor that produces our goods. The pandemic won't allow for that. If you want to stay safe, you have to think about those chains of touch, right? And even these ridiculous, so quote unquote, touchless technologies, all they do is hide the touch, right? So it means, okay, your delivery comes by robot, but somebody put it into the robot, right? Somebody sorted it in the warehouse and somebody made it, right? So I think it was being forced to think in more interconnected ways that may have softened more of us up to think about these racist atrocities and not say that's somebody else's issue.
There's a great line in the new introduction to On Fire, your latest book, when you say, whatever was bad before the disaster downgraded to unbearable. It's an unbearable situation, the way that, say, Black men are treated by the police.
Yeah, and I think, there's always this discourse whenever disasters hit of like, climate change doesn't discriminate. The pandemic doesn't discriminate. We're all in this together. But that's not true. That's not the way disasters act. They act as magnifiers and they act as intensifiers. And they're if you had a job in an Amazon warehouse that was making you sick before, right? And so many people were getting sick and injured in those warehouses. If you were in a long-term care facility that was already treating you as if your life, was of no value and your knowledge was of no value and was a sort of expression of our culture's disdain for our elders. That was bad before but all of it gets magnified to unbearable, right? If you were disposable before, you're sacrificial now. But honestly, Kath, I've been writing about disasters for a long time, and I've seen this again and again. I mean, I saw it in Katrina, in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. That whatever the inequalities, the injustices, the oppressions, whoever is being treated as disposable before the disaster strikes, it just gets that much worse. And honestly, we're only talking about the violence that we can see. And one of the things we have to talk more about is the violence that's hidden, and that's domestic violence. Because what we know from all of these disasters that I've just mentioned is that, when men, I'll just be very blunt, when men are stressed, women get it in the face, and so do kids. And in these lockdowns, and which are so stressful because families don't have any reprieve from each other, and even the best family needs a little bit of space.
They don't have much space or space to move. Yeah.
And
privacy.
Then you add layoffs, economic stress.
Yeah.
It's a very bad situation for women right now, and we're not talking about that because it isn't being caught on camera, and because we never talk about it.
I've been very struck by how durable this idea is that it affects everyone equally. It's the great leveler. It's such nonsense. They bring it out every time. It always needs to be refuted. And if we could just talk a little bit before we go to questions about the Green New Deal. I know you spent a lot of the last year, certainly before lockdown, working on it and working on the Bernie Sanders campaign. How does it all look now? I mean, do you feel more positive or less positive about the potential for it?
I feel I'm sorry, that was one of my trademark pauses. We were joking before that. I do this thing of pausing to think on stage, which apparently is quite unusual. But when it happens over video, what?
I was worried that it would make you look like you'd frozen and that people at home.
Yeah. Well, it's not a simple question. I have to think about it. On some level, it's harder. And you mentioned Bernie, and certainly my preferred outcome would be a presidential candidate who was running a campaign with the Green New Deal at its center. Because I do believe that we will only win this with an interplay of mass movement pressure from the outside, but also a receptivity from inside. And I think that we had that chance with Bernie. It's harder with Biden, but not impossible. Not impossible with Biden. And one of the things that I wrote about in On Fire, at the end of that book, I have a little 10 reasons why we in favor of a Green New Deal and why it's good climate policy. And one of those reasons at the end of the book was it's recession proof. I wrote that because we have this really bad track record in the climate movement of winning gains during times when the economy is doing relatively well. And because the kind of climate solutions that we've tended to get from governments, right, that are putting climate solutions on the table, they've tended to be these neoliberal market-based solutions, like climate taxes or cap and trade, or renewable energy policies that have tended to make energy costs more expensive, or be perceived to make energy costs more expensive, or carbon taxing that makes the price of petrol more expensive. And so as soon as you have an economic downturn, the support for these policies reliably evaporates. And we saw that after the 2008 financial crisis. People had rightly, unfortunately, associated climate action as something that was going to make their quality of life, their cost of life higher, right? And partly that's because, green products at the supermarket tend to be more expensive, right? And it got this reputation as being a bit of a bougie thing, like, as in the issue that you care about if you don't have to worry about putting food on the table. So I think what's important about a Green New Deal is that it's modeled after one of the greatest economic stimulus program of all time during the greatest economic crisis of all time, and that's FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression. And the whole idea behind the New Deal was to create millions of good jobs, was to stimulate the economy and bring it out of depression. And so because a Green New Deal is modeled as an economic stimulus, the biggest pushback that I got when I released On Fire, a little less than a year ago, was, yeah, but we don't do things like this when the economy is doing well. I heard that from a lot of journalists. Like, the only times that we can point to, and this is just a hard truth, when our societies have moved fast and changed big and catalytically, right, are moments of Great Depression or war, right? So if you think about what Britain did during the Second World War and the changes that people embraced in their lives, right? Not doing any luxury driving, thing of the past. Nobody did it. Accepting rationing of resources in order to support the war effort. These massive changes to people's lifestyles, they did it in a moment of true crisis. And so I heard a lot when I tried to advance this idea in a time which was not being diagnosed as a crisis, because of course the climate crisis is a crisis, and this is what we've been trying to say for a very long time, and that we all owe Greta Thunberg such a debt of gratitude for, because she did more than I think anyone to just hammer that message. We are in an emergency, treat it like one. The truth is that our culture didn't seem to be able to get on emergency footing in the face of the climate crisis. And so now we have this layering of a pandemic, an economic crisis, and the climate crisis. And I think our chances of acting swiftly and boldly in that context are greater than, when all economic indicators are good. We desperately need those jobs now. When unemployment levels are low, it's a little bit harder to make that case for, hey, let's create millions of jobs. There'll be better jobs, but still, right? It doesn't have the same kind of resonance and sense of urgency. The other issue, I think, the other thing we have going for us, and here I'll quote a great essay by the science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson that he wrote in the early days of the pandemic for The New Yorker. He said that the virus is rewriting our imaginations, and pointed to the fact that we now know that we can change quickly. We have seen it. We have dramatically changed our lives. Whether we are the ones who have changed their lives because they are on the front lines of this crisis, or because we've changed our lives and stayed home and figured out new ways of living. We now have a bodily experience that we have not had since the Second World War of that kind of change. And we found out that our governments had trillions of dollars that they could have marshaled this whole time. So all of that is potentially radicalizing. And that's why I do feel that we have a chance. I wouldn't describe myself as optimistic, because this is a future we have to fight for. And it's a fight. But if we just look objectively at moments in history when we have won big changes, they are in moments like this.
The time is now.
Is.
I'm also, the other aspect of it is that it shows people that dramatic, terrible things really do happen. I think one of the issues with the climate crisis, because it's apparently incremental, or as we know, it speeds up very often, and it certainly has been speeding up in the last few years, but that somehow people think, well, probably won't be in my lifetime, might be 200 years, 100 years, and it won't be anyone I know, and people convince themselves it's not going to happen. And this has reminded people that absolutely shocking things can happen, and happen to everyone alive on the planet, and that can bring us together, because we're all in the same boat in one way.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think that's one of the ways that our imaginations are being rewritten. And we're off script. I mean, that's the other thing that Kim Stanley Robinson said is, we now have this feeling that we're writing a science fiction novel together. Because this is not one of the hackneyed scripts, right? And there are certain hackneyed sci-fi scripts, but this virus that won't let us touch each other and the need to organize and massive racial justice uprisings in the middle of it. This is not a hackneyed story that we have just seen in a million Hollywood movies about what the future looks like. And that's exciting and empowering too, because there's a way in which there was the story of quote unquote apocalypse had been told and retold so many times in the same way that it developed this air of inevitability about it. But this is a new story. This is a different story. There are some elements to it that are common, that are a little bit cliche, like the Black Mirror kind of thing that Silicon Valley is trying to sell us. But there are some very fresh narrative elements in this thing we're living. And that means we just have to figure it out. And it also just, I think, shows that people who claim to have a sort of dominance-based relationship with reality, like the Trumps and that they can bully reality, are just so completely bluffing it and wrong and not to be trusted.
So over.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just for everyone, the essay that Naomi just mentioned is called "The Coronavirus is Rewriting Our Imaginations" by Kim Stanley Robinson, and it was in the May the 1st edition of the New Yorker. Okay, so we're going to go to some of your questions now. Question here from Chloe, Naomi. Says, for those of us desperate to see systemic change, what's the best way that we can make our voices heard and have an impact on national and local decision making? Is civil disobedience the best answer?
I think civil disobedience is part of it, and I think we're seeing that in the racial justice uprisings around the world. We're having conversations we never would have had if people had not taken to the streets and toppled monuments and broken rules and just demanded the attention. And we're not seeing action on the scale that is needed, but we are seeing some actual policy shifts, and we're seeing space open up to talk about transformative change. I mean, the fact that you have op-eds in the New York Times making cogent arguments for defunding the police. And challenging the entire logic of the carceral state by longtime abolitionist intellectuals and activists like Miriam Kaba, that was unthinkable a few months ago. And that is because of the space opened up by civil disobedience. So yeah, it is incredibly important. But as mentioned earlier, I also think electoral politics are important. That's why I volunteered for Bernie. It's why I support insurgent candidates like Jamal Bowman in New York, who just won his primary and is, set to join the squad in Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and so on. And I know these are American examples, but I think they're examples that should matter in other countries as well, because they really do show that when you have a critical mass of elected representatives, they don't necessarily need to be the prime minister or the president, as long as they have as long as they have real influence and as long as they have a block. And that's what's, I think, significant about the squad, calling themselves the squad and expanding the squad and enlarging the squad. They're the reason the Green New Deal is on the agenda right now. An interplay between social movements on the outside, engaging in civil disobedience, like occupying the offices of Nancy Pelosi, and there being figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley on the inside, taking up the call, standing with the demonstrators. So I think these are tools, I guess I would say, and I don't think there's any one tool that is the one that's gonna get us there alone.
Thank you. Another question here from Ben. How can the left become more effective in shaping public discourse when our media and press, present company accepted, thank you, Ben, are so invested in the neoliberal status quo?
Well, we do need alternative. We need to support the media outlets that are providing the space for the real debates that we need to have, doing the reporting that we need, putting the emphasis on the crises that are the true crises and not the trumped up, xenophobic distractions that so much of the press feeds and fuels. You should support whatever media you are consuming and feel is an exception to that. And that includes being a member of The Guardian. That includes the media outlets that, in the US, Democracy Now! Has been so critical. I'm a correspondent at The Intercept. We need to support media that is rising to the incredible responsibility of having a platform in this moment. I really do appreciate, especially I think when media organizations have made the decision to be free, right? It is really, really tricky right now because I don't know what The Guardian is experiencing. I know you've built up an incredible membership base, Kath, but I am hearing from independent media outlets in the States that they are losing monthly donors. And they're getting these letters saying, I hate doing this, but I've lost my job. I can't do it right now. And so I think for those of us who can, for those of us who are fortunate enough to still have jobs, to still have incomes, we have to support independent media, especially independent media that is making this moral choice to provide their content to everybody because they believe people have a right to the information. And anything you want to add there, Kath? Because
myself. That sounded great. I've got a question here from Martin Gray. He said, in Scotland, we have a vision to be a global leader in climate action and to create a one planet prosperity economy. How do you see the role of small progressive nations?
Yeah, incredibly important as beacons. We talked about New Zealand. And the kind of outsized influence that a smaller nation can have if it truly is leading. We are desperate for examples for proof of concept that it can work. And the fact that we could point to New Zealand and say, actually, you don't need mass surveillance and violating people's civil liberties to deal with this pandemic. You just need to invest in the infrastructure of care. Listen to scientists. It isn't about just having an app saying you got in contact with this person, stay home. It's about someone calling you and saying, do you have somewhere to stay? Can we help put you up? What about childcare for your kids? Do you need someone to walk your dog? Do you have food? That is not something a machine can do. That can only happen if we invest in the infrastructure of care. And so, yeah, I believe Scotland, has provided climate leadership, can do much more, and that when we have these beacons, they can be so powerful for activists around the world to just hammer their own governments with and go, you see, it can work, it can create jobs, it can lower energy costs, it can have mass support.
Another country with a fantastic woman leader as well, of course. Another question here. This person is anonymous. They ask, according to an article in today's Guardian, so it must be true, Mark Zuckerberg and Nick Clegg argue that the only way to hold the powerful to account is ultimately through the ballot box. Yes, and isn't the undemocratic and unaccountable power that Zuckerberg wields precisely the problem that we face?
It is a huge problem, and it is one of the. This is why when I use the word lockdown or closing down the economy, it's sort of in air quotes because this has been economically this has been a very strange period. There are large parts of our economy that have been frozen and will never recover, but there are other parts which have had huge growth in this period, and that includes the tech companies because of the things that we've talked about, that we do crave connection. And in this period of isolation, we've been more reliant on social media. We have been more reliant on Amazon. We have been more reliant on streaming and Netflix. And they have gotten very, very wealthy. I mean, we've never seen an economic downturn where billionaires have increased their wealth by hundreds of billions of dollars in this period. So yeah, it's a huge problem. It's a problem that Mark Zuckerberg's business model is based on extracting and commodifying our data, on cutting off funding sources for the media that we rely on. And it is connected to the ballot box because, there were candidates in the primary race in the United States that were talking about breaking up big tech and regulating big tech. And we aren't going to solve this problem with codes of conduct or just by complaining or, Facebook's charade of having, a board, an ethics board. Meredith Whitaker at the AI Now Institute at NYU talks about ethics washing, which is like greenwashing, but what the tech companies do with creating all these ethic boards, they don't want regulation. So I guess my answer to your question is we need to put it on the ballot. We need to demand political leaders that have the backbone to take on these tech companies and not just break them up, but I think one of the lessons of our experience of this pandemic is that access to the internet is an essential service. We need to treat it like one. We have to have a commons-based mindset about the digital sphere. If this is indeed a big part of the place where our kids are going to learn, where we're going to be getting health care and mental health care, and where we're going to be relating to our friends and family, then we need to have rights within this space. We are co-creators of Facebook and Twitter and all these. We are giving them so much free labor. I think we should be treating them as a public utility or a commons of some kind.
Like the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and we also need to use them less, but that's separate.
Well, I know that's your summer resolution, and I'm very impressed, and I think it'd be very good for all of us not to use social media very much.
Yeah. I think that as we open up a little bit and are able to be more face-to-face with people, I think we should try to challenge ourselves to be present. And I think now we've all gotten an important reminder of how precious our relationships are, our friendships are, and our time with loved ones. And so let's not be looking at our phones and being half there. Let's try to be present and use these technologies when we must and when they are really benefiting us. If it's saving a flight, if it's somewhere where we can't actually go, let's not make it our lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, even this event where I can see we've got 1,325 people tuning in right now. That's many more than we would have had if you'd flown to London to do it in person. It's kind of quite exciting. The potential is huge.
Exciting. Yeah. And I think we're figuring out how to get good at it.
Yeah. I've got a question here from David. Where do you see countries enacting the shock doctrine at the moment?
Israel. We are seeing just outrageous abuses of power and of this state of shock and lockdown and the way it limits people's ability to protest, with the annexation of large parts of the West Bank right now under Netanyahu. And even the fact that Netanyahu is still in power is an expression of the shock doctrine. He did not win this election. He did not win the last one. I don't think he won the one before that. He is a criminal, and he has very adeptly used this moment of shock to attack democracy within Israel, and I think much more gravely attack Palestinian land rights and annex land in just outrageous flouting of international law. Hungary, another contender. I believe Hungary is still being ruled by decree under cover of the pandemic. And the Trump administration has just been completely outrageous. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we don't have time to talk about because of the shocks and crises we're living every day, which is, there is this discourse around Trump of incompetence, right? We talk about what a buffoon he is and how he can't get anything done. And the dangerous thing about that frame is that it encourages us not to look at the things that he has been very, very good at, very, very competent at. Whether it's him or other people on his team, he is overseeing the most expansive attack on the regulatory infrastructure in the United States of any president before him, including Reagan. He is attacking every single environmental law, every law attacking water and air. It has been classic shock doctrine in terms of just, at first they said that it was a health risk to actually impose environmental, to make sure that their own environmental laws, to enforce their own environmental laws. I guess they couldn't send out people to oversee things like pipeline spills. But now it's being used as, well, we need to restart the economy, so anything that slows us down, like any red tape, we have to cut. That brings me to another example. In Australia, we're hearing that there needs to be a gas-led recovery, natural gas-led recovery, and that in order to do so, we need to cut the green tape. This is some of the discourse we're hearing from governments in Australia. So yeah, I could go on, but look, the shock doctrine is not going anywhere. It is my dream in life for that book to become compost, for people not to read it anymore. Unfortunately, it continues to have this life because this very hackneyed tactic continues to be used. But I would rather that we think about what a people's shock would actually look like, how we are going to use this crisis, not in opportunistic and cynical ways that are not about solving the real crises, that are in fact going to dig us deeper into the hole and make us more vulnerable to shocks and crises. That's what happens when you get rid of all the rules and you give a wish list to polluters and financial interests, which is what the Trump administration has done as well. But how are we going to really get at the roots of why we are experiencing these staccato shocks, whether they are the shocks of racist police violence and vigilante violence, whether they are the climate shocks, which, we're in the early days of summer, right? And so we are going to experience, and it gives me no joy to say this, we may not be talking about climate as much as we were a few months ago, but the earth will reassert itself. And we will be facing wildfires, and we will be facing record-breaking storms, because this has been another very, very, very hot year. And so we are going to be looking at an intersection of an economic crisis, a pandemic, and climate shocks. And some parts of the world have already experienced this. So how do we multitask? And that's what a Green New Deal is about. It's about connecting the dots between so many different crises and saying we need solutions that can battle systemic racism and economic inequality and lower our emissions in line with science at the same time. And here's how we do it.
We've got another question from Anonymous. I assume it's a different Anonymous. Is there any way to bridge the right-left divide in society that seems to be ever growing? This sort of sense of a really two sides not understanding each other, no bridge between them, two different medias, particularly in the US, two different ways of seeing the world, masks being the symbol perhaps.
Right. To be honest, I often find this the hardest question to answer because it does have so much to do with our information ecology. And so I think, one way we do it is by investing in public media. And, when you do live somewhere that has a public broadcaster that does transcend some of those partisan divides, don't underestimate the importance of it. Because when media is all private, it really does segment into these markets and these bubbles. And so I think, part of it is related to what we were talking about already, about the fact that we need to be publicly regulating our information commons because it is so important. We can't leave it up to Mark Zuckerberg and his ethics washing. But I also think that part of it is just winning elections and rolling out the policies, which is to say, you know, one of the things I talk about in On Fire is how when FDR won election in 1933 and introduced the New Deal, it was opposed by Republicans in red states. And he was very, very political about how he rolled out the programs. For instance, there's one of the key programs under the original New Deal that's very relevant to our moment is the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a nature's army of young people. They hired 2 million young people from families that were suffering in the Depression. So they were families who were receiving relief money. And they sent their boys, there were just a handful of girls, it was mostly boys, into the woods and into the farms to plant trees. They planted 2.3 billion trees. You've heard me talk about this before, Kath. And they built 800 state parks. That's also really relevant because another thing that we have, you know, there's been all of this shaming about people crowding public parks, right? Like, oh, they're not social distancing. And I just feel like it's so interesting that people want nature so badly, right? And we don't have enough of it. That's why we're crowding into parks. So we need more green space. We need more wilderness trails. But back to the politics of it, FDR, if you look at the map of where FDR created these Civilian Conservation Corps projects and camps, and overlay it on the electoral map of the people who didn't vote for him in 1933, what you see is he cited these projects in the locations that did not vote for him the first time, and many of them flipped and voted for him the second time. Now that gives me hope about overcoming partisan divide, because when you're having an abstract debate about something like the Green New Deal, people dig in. But if this is the thing that created jobs for your neighbors, that lowered your electricity costs, that created an amazing new park, then it stops being an abstract political issue and it just becomes something practical. And so I think we just need to get practical as much as we can. And that does require winning elections. And that does require dealing with the fact that we live in a partisan world.
Yeah. God, I'd love to join a Civilian Conservation Corps, wouldn't you?
I wouldn't. I want that for young people too right now who are so isolated. I mean, you can too, Kath.
Get in.
No, but it's funny. I sort of informally polled some students at the university where I teach at Rutgers about this idea, and a lot of them talked about, first of all, yes, get me out of my home with my parents. Oh. Like I want to set me free. But also, they really want escape from their screens, a lot of them. They know that this period of just total technological immersion is not healthy. And the idea of sort of having their hands in soil and being in nature is really appealing to a lot of them. Some of them were like, no way, I like being indoors.
Okay, so it's been a very hopeful evening, Naomi, in fact. But I just would like to end in this question from Sue, because I think she probably expresses how quite a lot of people are feeling. Sue says, I feel depressed and I feel hopeless. What can I do to bring about some positive change? And I wonder if we could end on that question.
Absolutely. So I think the most important thing for us to understand is that even though we may be alone right now, like Sue may be at home alone looking at a screen and looking at us talk, there are more than 1,000 people who have decided to do the same thing, right? And we are just one glimpse of an incredible period of organizing where people are finding each other. They're finding each other on these sorts of webinars, but they're also finding each other in the streets. And when we talk about crises that are global in scale and that do require such deep change, if we think about it as something that we personally have to fix, it will be really disempowering. So there are things that we can do about this. We can eat a plant-based diet. We'll be healthier for it. It'll be better for the earth. we can do many things to lower our carbon footprint. But ultimately, we're only going to do this if we find other people and we do things together. And that is also, I think, going to be so good for our spirits, because, coming back to, I think, something that's come up a lot, that we're not built. We are social beings. We don't belong in these boxes. And so, my hope for this period is that in slowing down, I think we are more conscious of crises that long predate COVID. We had an anxiety crisis, a depression crisis, an opioid crisis, a spiritual crisis before this. And that's not to mention all the other crises we've been talking about. But in slowing down, I think we get in touch with them and we notice them. And so in the way we are getting this message to slow down, and we have to figure out how to live with this virus and not just be at war with it. And so I think we in figuring out how to do that, we also have to figure out how we can be together and support each other. Maybe that's a new climate conservation corps where young people get to live in community. They're able to test them on the way in. It's much easier to secure that kind of an environment than it is to secure a university where people are coming in and out. So maybe it makes sense to have a gap year and do that work of repairing our relationship and the damage we've done to the natural world. I think we should declare these years that we are living with the virus as the years of repair, the years where we repair our relationship with the earth and repair our relationships with each other. Where we actually do the work of reparation. Capitalism tells us we can never stop. And that's why there has been this one of the reasons why there has been this long delayed appointment with history, rendezvous with history. And in this moment where we pause, we're willing to look back, right? And so let's build on that. I mean, I think it's so inspiring that we're having conversations about who those guys are in the statues and all the squares. And we could actually rehistoricize our present and tell a truer story about how we got here, at whose expense. And that has to inform how we move forward. I don't believe we'll ever get another chance like this. Do that hard work, but incredibly rewarding work. I think it's work that lifts our spirits, that tells us that we're not alone, and I just hope that we don't let it pass us by.
Naomi, thank you very much. It's always fascinating to talk to you. I think tonight has been inspiring and moving as well. And to everyone in this Guardian Live event, I do hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thanks very much for tuning in.
Thank you. Thank you, Kath.